What would you do if the walls of wealth echoed with a child's whisper? One so fragile it could either break your heart or save your soul. If this story touches your heart, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the rest of this journey. The underground parking garage of Whitaker Tower in Boulder, Colorado, was never truly silent. Even after midnight, the hum of fluorescent lights and the faint drip of condensation from the concrete ceiling created a sterile rhythm, the kind of sound a man like James Whitaker had grown used to. To most, the garage was a cold space, steel, stone, and shadow. To James, it was the final threshold of his fortress, a place where he could shed the public image of a billionaire CEO and retreat into solitude. But that night, the silence cracked. It wasn't the sound of tires screeching or security radios buzzing. It was something much smaller. A sniffle. Fragile. Human. Out of place. James stopped mid-step, his Italian leather shoes brushing against the concrete. He turned, scanning the rows of glossy vehicles that lined the garage. His Tesla Model S gleamed beneath the harsh lights, untouched, waiting for him like a loyal hound. Yet his eyes drifted past it, into the shadows between two forgotten sedans. There, curled in the dark, was a little girl. Her hair hung limp, strands plastered to her pale cheeks. She couldn't have been more than 6. Her knees were drawn tight to her chest, her small arms wrapped around them as if she were bracing against a storm. On her left hand clung a strange adhesive patch, bright red against her tiny wrist, the color too deliberate to be anything but medical. "Please," she whispered, so soft it could have been mistaken for the sigh of the ventilation fans. "Please don't tell them I'm here." James felt something stir in his chest, something he had buried under layers of contracts, negotiations, and boardroom victories. His throat tightened. For a moment, he was no longer James Whitaker, the man who had conquered tech markets across 3 continents. He was simply a man standing in front of a child who should never have known this kind of fear. "Who are you?" His voice came out lower than he expected, his instinct to sound commanding tempered by an unfamiliar gentleness. The girl flinched. Her wide eyes shimmered in the half-light. "Lila," she murmured. Her lips trembled around the name, as if speaking it might bring danger closer. He crouched down, careful not to make sudden moves. "Lila," he repeated, letting the name settle in the space between them. "Why are you here?" The girl's thin shoulders shook. I can't go back. Please don't make me." James glanced around. No one else. Just rows of empty cars and the echo of his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. He noticed now that her clothes were frayed, jeans too big, a sweatshirt that must have belonged to someone else. But it was the bruises on her arms that made his stomach turn. They were fresh, purple blooming into blue, framed by more of those strange red patches. He extended his coat toward her. "You're cold," he said. She hesitated, then reached out, her tiny fingers brushing the wool. As she pulled it around herself, her eyes never left him, filled with suspicion, but also, he realized, hope. James sat on the ground across from her, expensive suit brushing against the grit of the concrete. He didn't care. "Who are you hiding from, Lila?" Her lips pressed into a thin line. Then, so faint he nearly missed it, she said, "Greg." The name meant nothing to James, but the way she said it, like a curse she wasn't supposed to speak, made the air grow colder. James rubbed his temples. He wasn't a man who stumbled into strangers' tragedies. His life was tightly scheduled, his emotions tightly locked. But here she was, a ghost in the shadows of his empire, shattering that careful order. "Lila," he said slowly, "you can't stay here. It isn't safe." Her eyes filled with tears. Nowhere is safe. The words cut deeper than any business negotiation ever had. James had heard lies, betrayals, and desperate pleas in conference rooms across the world, but never with this kind of raw truth. He exhaled, realizing there was no walking away. "All right," he whispered. "I'll take you upstairs, just for tonight." Her breath caught. For the first time, her tiny body loosened. The trembling lessened. She nodded. James rose and offered his hand. Her small palm fit into his with a weight that startled him, not heavy in body, but heavy in meaning. As he led her across the garage, the CEO, who once believed himself untouchable, felt the unmistakable tug of responsibility. At the elevator, her reflection shivered in the mirrored doors. Lila looked so small, so misplaced in the towering shadow of his wealth. When the doors closed around them, silence filled the space again. Only this time, James heard something new beneath it. His own heart breaking open. He didn't know yet who Greg was, or what those crimson patches meant, or how far this night would carry him from the fortress he thought was unshakable. All he knew was this. One whisper in a parking garage had already rewritten the story of his life. The elevator doors opened with a muted chime, spilling warm golden light into the dimness. James Whitaker stepped out, his hand still gently guiding the little girl beside him. Wrapped in his oversized wool coat, Lila Monroe looked like a shadow against the gleaming marble floor of the executive level. This was his world. Glass walls, modern art, panoramic views of the Flatirons beyond Boulder. The tower represented wealth, order, and absolute control. Yet as James led the child inside, he realized how absurdly sterile it felt, how unfit it was for someone so fragile. "Are you hungry?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Lila nodded but didn't speak. She clutched the coat tighter, as though it were her last defense against the world. James guided her toward his private office, a cavern of polished wood and steel where billion-dollar contracts had been signed. Tonight, it was nothing more than a shelter. He opened a drawer and pulled out a box of granola bars he usually ignored. Lila took one, unwrapped it slowly, and nibbled at the corner with the precision of someone used to making food last. James felt a twist in his stomach watching her. A child shouldn't know hunger like that. As she ate, her eyes darted around the room, lingering on the city skyline outside the glass. For a moment, James thought she might relax. But then, unprompted, she whispered, "He'll hear the buzzing in the walls." James froze. "What do you mean?" Her small hands trembled around the wrapper. "Greg. He makes the buzzing. He says it makes Mom sleep. Sometimes it makes her forget everything." James crouched down so his eyes were level with hers. "Lila, who is Greg?" She shook her head violently, crumbs scattering across the desk. "If I say too much, he'll come. He said no one would believe me anyway." James felt the weight of her fear pressing against his chest. He wanted to tell her she was safe, but even he couldn't be sure of that. The patches on her arms, the bruises, the strange way she spoke about her mother, it all pointed to something far beyond a lost child's story. "Your mom," James said carefully. "Where is she now?" The girl's lips quivered. "Sleeping, always sleeping. Sometimes she talks to the walls instead of me." James's jaw tightened. He had seen broken people before, investors ruined, rivals crushed, but nothing compared to the hollow despair in this child's voice. He handed her a glass of water. "Drink. Slowly." Lila obeyed, taking tiny sips. She seemed so small sitting there in his office chair, dwarfed by the high back and armrests. James studied her closely. Thin frame, pale skin stretched too tight, dark circles under her eyes. Malnutrition, neglect, signs that she had been invisible for far too long. The intercom buzzed suddenly, making her flinch so hard the water sloshed. James clicked it off at once, cursing under his breath. He had never realized how violent such a harmless sound could seem. "It's all right," he said softly. "No one's going to hurt you here." She stared at him, studying his face as though testing the truth of his words. Then, in the smallest voice, she said, "You remind me of someone before the buzzing." James tilted his head. "Who?" She blinked, fighting tears. "Mom. Before Greg." A silence stretched between them. James didn't know how to respond. For the first time in years, he felt utterly powerless. Finally, he spoke. "Lila, I promise you, I'm going to find out what's happening. You don't have to carry this alone." Her expression shifted, a flicker of hope breaking through the fear. Slowly, she pulled a crumpled piece of paper from the pocket of her sweatshirt. She placed it on the desk in front of him. It was a child's drawing, stick figures holding hands under a crooked sun. Above them, she had written in uneven letters, "Mom, me, Bunny." Next to them, a larger figure was crossed out violently, the black crayon lines pressed deep into the paper. James's breath caught. Whoever that erased figure was, it had left scars more permanent than ink. "Did you draw this?" he asked gently. She nodded. "Greg doesn't like it when I draw. He says I shouldn't remember." James felt his pulse quicken. Whoever this Greg was, he wasn't just cruel. He was deliberate, systematic. He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Lila, do you know where your mom is right now?" Her small fingers curled into fists. "Motel. The one with the broken ice machine. Room smells like mold." James's mind began to race. He had the resources to find it, to track down the exact location. But the question was whether to involve law enforcement immediately or whether the wrong move could put the child in even more danger. The clock on the wall ticked past midnight. James realized he hadn't thought of himself once since finding her. For the first time in decades, it didn't matter. "You're safe tonight," he said firmly. "That's my promise." Lila studied him, then, hesitant but decisive, reached for a crayon left on his desk from some forgotten charity project. She bent over the drawing and added one more figure, tall, standing beside her and her mother. No face yet, just a silhouette. James looked at it, throat tightening. When she glanced up, her eyes were wet but steady. "I drew you," she whispered. The billionaire CEO who had built an empire out of logic and control felt his world tilt. This wasn't a deal, a merger, or a calculated investment. This was trust, raw, undeserved, fragile trust. He folded the paper carefully, sliding it into his pocket like it was more valuable than the contracts locked in his vault. "Thank you," he said softly. "I'll keep it safe." For the first time, Lila leaned against him, her tiny frame pressed into his side, her breathing uneven but calmer now. James let her rest. But inside, his mind was anything but calm. Somewhere in Denver, a woman lay forgotten in a motel room, and a man named Greg was using children as pawns in a game James didn't yet understand. And yet, as Lila's small hand gripped his sleeve, James knew one thing with certainty: walking away was no longer an option. The next morning in Boulder was pale and brittle, the kind of cold that seeped into bone rather than skin. James Whitaker hadn't slept. He sat in his office chair, staring at the folded drawing Lila had left behind, the one where she had drawn him standing beside her and her mother. It felt heavier than anything he had ever signed, a contract written not with ink, but with trust. Now it was time to act. Lila was still asleep on the couch, curled beneath a blanket far too large for her, her little fists clenched even in dreams. James moved quietly, not wanting to wake her, and pulled up his laptop. With the precision that had once built his empire, he traced the faint hospital bracelet still hanging loose around her wrist. On it was a number, stamped beneath the letters NBX42. The sequence wasn't random. It was a code tied to a pharmaceutical trial. His instincts screamed this was bigger than a missing child. The search pulled up a fragment of a Denver emergency room record. Isabel Monroe. Patient discharged against medical advice. Condition: unstable. Isabel. Lila's mother. James didn't think twice. Within the hour, he was on I-25 South, his car slicing through the winter highway toward Denver. He left his assistant a vague message about rescheduling meetings, but he didn't explain. How could he? Explaining meant admitting that the fortress of James Whittaker had been breached by a whisper in the night. By noon, he pulled into a cracked asphalt lot of a rundown motel near Colfax Avenue. The sign flickered half-dead neon. Sunset Inn. The kind of place where people vanished and no one asked questions. James pushed open the door to room 12. The air was thick with mildew, the curtains yellowed from smoke. The stench of neglect clung to every surface. On the bed lay a woman, thin, still, her hair matted to her forehead. Isabel Monroe. Her skin was pale, her breathing shallow. Around her arms were the same crimson patches he had seen on Lila, only more of them, layered like grotesque stickers on fragile skin. God, James whispered. He rushed forward, checking for a pulse. Faint, but present. Her body was limp, her lips dry. There was no food in the room, no water on the nightstand. Only empty bottles, stained tissues, and a cracked Bible shoved under the bed. On the cracked wall hung a child's drawing, pinned with tape peeling at the corners. James leaned closer. Crude crayon lines showed a family. Mom, me, Bunny. The same as the paper Lila had given him, except this one had a fourth figure violently scribbled over in black, erased to near oblivion. The image shook him more than he expected. Whoever that figure had been, he was no longer welcome in this family. James grabbed his phone. His voice trembled with urgency as he called 911. This is James Whittaker. I need an ambulance at the Sunset Inn, room 12. A woman is unresponsive. Possible overdose or chemical exposure. Please hurry. As he waited, he pulled back one of the crimson patches on Isabel's arm. Beneath it, her skin was raw, inflamed. Printed faintly on the back of the patch was a sequence. NBX42. The same code. James's chest tightened. He had read about black market medical trials in hushed whispers across Wall Street, but never thought he would hold proof in his own hands. When the paramedics arrived, James stepped aside. They worked quickly, inserting IV lines, checking her airway, lifting her frail body onto the stretcher. Sir, is she family? One asked. James hesitated. His instinct was to say no, that he was just a bystander, but as he looked down at Isabel, then at the crumpled drawing taped to the wall, the words caught in his throat. Yes, he said finally. She's family. The paramedics didn't question it further. They wheeled her out, their equipment rattling against the metal gurney. James stayed behind for a moment, scanning the room again. That was when he noticed it. A stack of papers shoved under the bed frame. He pulled them out. Medical consent forms, NBX42, each one signed with shaky handwriting, Isabel Monroe. But what chilled him most were the margins of the documents. Scribbled notes in red pen. Subjects: female, child, memory suppression trial. He swallowed hard. They hadn't just experimented on Isabel. They had targeted Lila. Sirens wailed faintly outside as the ambulance pulled away. James pocketed the papers, his knuckles white. Back in his car, he dialed his head of security. Find everything you can on NBX-42. Trials, labs, shell companies, and run the name Isabel Monroe through every record you can find. Right away, sir. James hung up, his gaze falling to the drawing he had taken from his office. He unfolded it once more. Now it wasn't just a child's picture. It was evidence, a testimony from the only witness who mattered. As he drove toward St. Albans Hospital in Denver, where Isabel would be admitted, James realized something irrevocable. He was already in too deep to turn back. This wasn't philanthropy. This wasn't charity. This was survival, for Lila, for Isabel, and perhaps for children he hadn't even met yet. And for the first time in years, James felt a clarity sharper than any business deal. His empire had been built on technology, but his future, his redemption, would be built on protecting this fragile family. The drawing crinkled softly in his pocket, as if reminding him of the promise he hadn't spoken aloud, but already knew. He would not let them disappear. The corridors of St. Albans Hospital in Denver buzzed with the kind of energy James Whitaker had never known. In the boardrooms of his empire, silence was a weapon. Here, silence was a verdict. Machines beeped, nurses rushed, and every second felt alive with consequence. James stood just outside the emergency unit where Isabel Monroe lay unconscious. He had expected relief once she was admitted, but instead, a heavier weight pressed on him. The patches, the crimson stickers marked NBX-42, haunted him like bloodstains that wouldn't wash away. He tightened his grip on the folder of documents he had taken from the motel. He needed answers. "Mr. Whitaker?" a nurse called. "Dr. Lee will see you now?" James followed down a narrow hallway, past double doors, into a quieter wing reserved for consultation. When he stepped inside, he froze. Standing by the window, her dark hair pulled into a neat bun, was a face he had not seen in nearly a decade. Dr. Sienna Lee. "James," she said softly, her voice carrying both surprise and a shadow of old memory. He nodded, almost forgetting to breathe. Years ago, Sienna had been one of the brightest scientists at a biotech subsidiary his company once invested in. Then she had walked away, dramatically and publicly, after accusing the pharmaceutical board of covering up illegal trials. He remembered the fallout, the hearings, the whispers about her career being ruined. Now she stood before him, lab coat crisp, eyes sharp. "I didn't expect you here," she said. "I didn't expect to be here," James admitted, then handed her the stack of papers. "But this is what they were doing to Isabel Monroe and her daughter." Sienna scanned the documents, her brow furrowed as she flipped through page after page. "NBX-42, she muttered. "I should have known." "You've seen this before?" Her lips pressed tight. "Not directly, but I warned about it. NBX-42 was supposed to be a neural suppressant, developed for military use, memory conditioning, suppression of trauma in soldiers. The FDA killed it after Phase 2 trials. Too dangerous. Irreversible side effects, but..." She tapped the margin notes. "This isn't military anymore. Someone resurrected it, and they're using it on civilians, on children." James's chest tightened. Lila had those patches on her arm. Isabel, too. Sienna set the papers down, her hands trembling despite her composed voice. "Then they're not just subjects. They're survivors, if they live long enough." James leaned closer. "Who's behind this?" The doctor's eyes darkened. Gregory Knox. The name cut through the air like glass. James frowned. Knox? He used to work with you. Yes, Sienna said bitterly. Brilliant, arrogant, obsessed with control. When NBX 42 was shut down, he lost everything. But instead of walking away, he went underground. He believed children were the key, their brains more malleable, easier to reshape. I tried to expose him years ago. No one listened. Her gaze flicked to James. And now you've brought me proof. James paced the room, his thoughts colliding. If he's still running these trials, then Lila is a target. Isabel, too. Sienna crossed her arms. More than a target. They're evidence. And Knox won't let evidence walk away. The weight of her words pressed on him. He thought of Lila's trembling voice in the garage, her whisper, "Please don't let them know I'm here." Now he understood why. Isabel, James asked quietly, can she recover? Sienna sighed, her clinical calm pierced by sorrow. We stabilized her, but the patches release synthetic compounds that integrate into the nervous system. Withdrawal is brutal. Memory gaps, seizures, organ strain. She's not out of danger. And Lila? Sienna hesitated. Children are more resilient, but also more vulnerable. Her scans already show irregularities. If Knox's design is what I think it is, her brain might be adapting, or unraveling. James pressed his hand against the cold glass of the window. Then we need to stop him before it kills her. Sienna studied him. You're not here as a CEO, are you? You're here as... She trailed off, searching for the word. James answered it for her. Family. For a long moment, silence hung between them. Not the sterile silence of boardrooms, but the kind that carried the weight of unspoken vows. Finally, Sienna broke it. If we can get Isabel stable, we may be able to reverse some of the compound's effects, but we'll need samples, patches, the active serum. James's jaw clenched. Then I'll get them. She gave a humorless laugh. You don't just get them, James. Knox doesn't operate in daylight. He hides behind shell corporations, clinics that vanish overnight, labs buried in basements. He has money, reach, and no conscience. James met her gaze with a steadiness he hadn't felt in years. So do I. Except the conscience. Before Sienna could reply, a nurse burst into the room. Dr. Lee, you need to see this. They rushed back to Isabel's unit. On the monitor, her vitals spiked erratically, alarms shrieking. Nurses worked frantically, adjusting IV drips, trying to calm her thrashing body. James's throat tightened. Isabel's face contorted as if battling demons only she could see. Patches, Sienna muttered. The compounds are reacting. James watched helplessly as orderlies restrained Isabel's limbs. He had seen chaos before, in markets crashing, in deals collapsing, but never like this. This wasn't numbers. This was flesh, blood, and stolen life. When the episode finally eased, Isabel lay limp again, her chest rising and falling shallowly. Sienna exhaled. This won't stop until we cut her off completely. James stared at the crimson squares still clinging to her arms. Tiny, almost insignificant looking. Yet they had the power to erase memory, to rewrite identity. He whispered to himself, all because of a patch. At that moment, he understood what Lila had meant when she said, he makes the buzzing. He makes Mom forget. James felt anger building in his chest, sharper than anything he had known in decades of competition. Knox wasn't just experimenting. He was stealing lives, rewriting them. And James Whitaker, who once thought his wealth had insulated him from the world's cruelties, realized he had just stepped into the center of a war he could not walk away from. The snow outside St. Albans Hospital had begun to fall in heavy, silent sheets, covering Denver in a muffled white. From the 12th floor window, James Whitaker watched the city blur into a pale haze. He had faced hostile takeovers and courtroom battles, but never had he felt this fragile, this cornered. Behind him, Lila sat cross-legged on the couch in his temporary suite at the hospital, crayons scattered across the coffee table. She had drawn again. Tonight's picture was different. A house, sketched in yellow, windows glowing with orange warmth. In front of it stood 3 figures, hand in hand. Mom, me, Daddy. James's throat tightened as he stared at it. Daddy? The word had been written in uneven, deliberate letters, as if she had practiced it over and over before daring to inscribe it. He forced a smile for her sake, but inside, fear gnawed. Isabel was still unconscious 2 floors below. Dr. Sienna Lee was pushing her limits, trying to stabilize her against compounds that weren't meant to be fought. And Gregory Knox, the ghost behind the crimson patches, was somewhere out there, watching. The shrill ping of James's phone jolted him. A new email notification flashed across the screen. No subject, no sender. He opened it. "Stop now, Whitaker, or the girl disappears." James froze. His grip on the phone tightened until his knuckles whitened. His gaze darted toward Lila. She was still humming softly, lost in her drawing, oblivious to the venomous threat hanging in digital ink. His chest tightened with a rage he hadn't known he was capable of. He turned off the screen, slipped the phone into his pocket, and forced his voice to remain calm. "Lila, are you tired?" She shook her head, still coloring. "No, I want to finish The Sun. It's brighter than the buzzing." The buzzing. James felt a chill at the word. Knox's fingerprints were everywhere, even in her metaphors. He excused himself, stepping into the hallway. Within moments, he had his head of security, Daniel Kerr, on the line. "I need a trace on an email," James ordered. His voice was low, steady, dangerous. "Anonymous sender. Threat against a child. I want every server, every backdoor scanned. Knox is testing me." Kerr exhaled sharply. "Understood, sir, but if he's as sophisticated as you say, he'll have masked it." "Then unmask it," James snapped. When he returned to the suite, he found Lila had curled into the corner of the couch, the blanket pulled to her chin. She had fallen asleep mid-drawing, crayon still in hand. James took it gently from her, laying it aside. He sat across from her, watching the soft rise and fall of her chest. The innocence of sleep looked so fragile against the shadow of Knox's warning. "Stop now, or the girl disappears." The words burned in his skull. For once in his life, James understood exactly how little his wealth could buy. Money could build towers, but it could not erase threats whispered from the dark. Hours later, when the suite had fallen silent, he slipped down to Isabel's floor. He found Dr. Sienna Lee standing by the monitors, her expression grim. "How is she?" he asked. Sienna glanced at him, exhaustion etched across her features. "Stable, but just barely. Every time her body resists, the compounds adapt. It's like fighting smoke with bare hands." James told her about the email. The color drained from her face. "He knows you're involved now," she whispered. "That makes you dangerous to him. And her." She paused, her eyes flicking upward toward where Lila slept. "Vulnerable." James nodded. "That's why I'm moving them, both Isabel and Lila. Tonight. Somewhere Knox won't reach them." "You can't just hide from him," Sienna warned. "He has resources, networks. He'll follow." "Then let him." James said, his jaw set. But I won't leave them exposed. As they spoke, a nurse hurried past, whispering urgently to another. James caught fragments. Camera. Unauthorized access. What camera? He demanded. The nurse hesitated, then admitted, We found footage from the security wing. A man dressed as a physician entered the restricted unit earlier tonight. He tried to access Ms. Monroe's room before being interrupted. The badge he used was cloned. James's stomach dropped. He didn't need the name. He already knew. Knox. He turned to Sienna. Get Isabel ready. She moves with me tonight. Sienna frowned. To where? James's voice was cold steel. Somewhere only I control. By the time he returned to the suite, Lila had stirred. She rubbed her eyes and sat up, blinking at him. Did you find Mom? James crouched beside her, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. She's resting, and she'll be safe. But for tonight, I need you to trust me. She studied him with eyes far older than her years. I do, she whispered. Then she reached for the paper she had been drawing. In the corner, she had sketched another figure, tall, looming, faceless. That's the man who watches, she said simply. James felt his chest tighten. Even in crayon, Knox's presence infected everything. He folded the paper carefully, sliding it into his pocket beside the other drawing. His heart hammered as he thought of the threat again. Stop now, or the girl disappears. Not while I'm alive, James swore silently. The snow outside thickened, burying Denver under a white silence. But inside the tower of St. Albans, a different storm gathered, one that would not melt away with the morning sun. For the first time in his life, James Whitaker understood that his empire meant nothing compared to the weight of one child's safety. And Gregory Knox had just declared war. The winter dawn broke faintly over Denver, casting a silver glow through the frosted windows of St. Albans Hospital. James Whitaker had not closed his eyes all night. He sat by Isabel's bedside, his hand resting lightly on the rail as machines hummed and beeped. Her face was ashen, her breathing shallow. He thought of Lila upstairs, sleeping in his suite with a stuffed bunny a nurse had given her. For a child who had lived in shadows, she had managed to find trust. But trust was fragile, and this morning it would be tested. A sudden alarm shattered the quiet. Isabel's heart rate spiked, then plummeted. Nurses swarmed the room, voices sharp and urgent. James stepped back as Dr. Sienna Lee rushed in, eyes blazing with focus. She's crashing, one nurse said. Stabilize the line, bolus 1 milligram, now, Sienna barked. James's pulse raced. He had seen markets collapse in seconds, fortunes vanish in a heartbeat. But nothing compared to the sight of Isabel's body convulsing against the sheets, as if some unseen force was tearing her apart. Then, from behind him came a terrified scream. Daddy! James turned. Lila stood in the doorway, barefoot, eyes wide with terror. Before he could move, she staggered forward, clutching her head. Her small body trembled violently, her lips blue. My God, Sienna gasped. She's seizing too! James lunged, catching Lila before she hit the floor. Her tiny frame convulsed in his arms, eyes rolling back. Get her on a gurney, Sienna shouted. James carried her, his voice breaking. Stay with me, Lila. Stay with me. They rushed into the adjacent pediatric unit. Nurses scrambled, attaching monitors, securing IV lines. Lila's body writhed, every spasm ripping through James's chest like a blade. Sienna worked swiftly, her voice sharp and steady. We need labs now! Full panel! James hovered by the bed, helpless, his fists clenched so tightly his nails cut into his palms. He forced himself to breathe, to focus. What's happening to her? Sienna glanced at the monitor. Her system's collapsing. The compound, NBX-42, it's been activated somehow. It's attacking her nervous system. James's voice cracked. Activated how? Sienna's jaw tightened. It's designed to respond to external triggers. Could be sound, could be chemical, could be... She cut herself off, eyes flashing. It's the patches. Even residual exposure is enough. They planted a parasite. James felt the world tilt. A parasite? Not biological. Synthetic. Programmed. It latches onto neural pathways, feeds off electrical activity, and once it fully embeds... She stopped, her silence worse than any words. One of the nurses turned, face pale. Her oxygen's dropping, 75%. Sienna snapped. Bag her now. Do not let her crash. James leaned over, gripping Lila's hand. It was ice cold, her fingers twitching. You're stronger than this, he whispered fiercely. You're not alone anymore. For a terrifying moment, the monitor flatlined. No! James roared, his chest exploding with anguish. Don't you dare leave me! Sienna slammed a syringe into the line. Epinephrine, now. The beep returned, faint but steady. James sagged against the bed, his forehead pressed to the rail as relief and terror warred inside him. But Sienna's face was grim. This is temporary. If we don't find an antidote, she won't last the night. James lifted his head, his voice raw. Then make one. Her eyes locked with his. That's not how it works, James. We need something to counteract the compound, something tailored, and that takes time we don't have. James's mind raced, every deal, every battle flashing through him. Then, suddenly, a memory. Fort Carson, Colorado Springs, the military trials, the vaccine V92, his own blood, drawn again and again as they tested resilience against synthetic agents. He turned back to Sienna, his voice low but steady. What if I've already been exposed to something similar? Years ago, military trials, vaccine V92. Sienna froze. V92? Yes, classified project. They said it failed, but I survived. Her eyes widened. If that's true, your plasma might hold adaptive antibodies. It could neutralize the parasite. James stepped closer, his voice firm. Then take it. Take whatever you need. Just save her. Sienna hesitated only a second before nodding. We'll need to process it, synthesize a serum. But James... She lowered her voice. There are risks. If it doesn't match, it could trigger organ failure. She might not survive the attempt. James's throat burned. He looked down at Lila, her fragile chest rising and falling under the weight of machines. She had called him Daddy. Not once, not out of desperation, but with conviction. He couldn't lose her. Do it, he said hoarsely. If there's even a chance, do it. Sienna gave orders. Nurses rushed to prepare equipment, drawing James's blood, spinning it down in centrifuges. The room became a storm of movement, tubes, vials, monitors, screaming. James never left Lila's side. He held her hand, whispering words he never thought he'd speak. I'm here, no matter what. I won't let you go. When Sienna returned with the syringe of pale serum, her hands shook, though her voice was steady. This is untested. Once I inject it, her system will either fight or collapse. James nodded. Then let her fight with me in her veins. Sienna plunged the needle into the IV port. For a moment, nothing happened. Then Lila's body arched violently, monitors shrieking. James gripped her hand, his heart hammering. "Come on," he begged. "Stay with me." Her pulse spiked, then crashed. For 3 endless seconds, the monitor flatlined again. James felt his soul tear. And then... beep, beep, beep. The line steadied. Her chest rose in a calmer rhythm. Color slowly returned to her lips. Sienna exhaled, shoulders sagging. "She's stabilizing." James bowed his head, his eyes burning. A tear slipped free, falling onto Lila's tiny hand. She stirred, eyelids fluttering. For a fleeting second, her gaze met his. "Daddy," she whispered, faint but clear. James broke. He leaned down, pressing his forehead to hers, his tears mingling with her fragile breath. In that moment, it didn't matter that he was a billionaire CEO, or that the world outside raged with threats. In that moment, he was simply what she had chosen him to be. And he knew. He would burn his empire to ash before letting Gregory Knox touch her again. The sterile air of St. Albans was still thick with the echoes of last night's chaos. James Whittaker hadn't moved from the bedside since Lila's collapse. Her tiny hand remained curled in his, the monitor beside her tracing each fragile heartbeat like a promise. He hadn't prayed in years, not since childhood nights on his parents' ranch outside Cheyenne. But as dawn spilled through the blinds, he whispered silent vows into the morning light. "Don't take her. Not her." Dr. Sienna Lee entered quietly, carrying a tray of vials. Her eyes were ringed with exhaustion, but her movements were precise. She set the tray on the counter and looked at James. "She's stable, for now," Sienna said. "But the serum we created last night was only a first strike. The parasite is adaptive. It will push back." James stroked Lila's hair. "Then we hit it again." Sienna hesitated. "That's what I came to discuss. Your plasma isn't just compatible. It's unique. The V92 trials altered your immune profile permanently. Your blood carries antibodies that shouldn't exist. They're binding to the parasite in ways we've never seen." James met her gaze, unflinching. "So I keep giving until she's clear." Sienna's voice lowered. "It's not that simple. Each time we harvest, your body weakens. We've already taken more than is safe. If we push too far..." He cut her off. "She lives. That's all that matters." For a moment, Sienna simply studied him. She had known James Whittaker in boardrooms and labs, a man who measured worth in returns. But this version of him, raw, relentless, willing to bleed for a child who wasn't even his by blood, was unrecognizable and undeniable. "I'll prepare the next extraction," she said quietly. By midday, the lab was alive with urgency. Machines hummed, centrifuges spun, and vials of James's blood were fed into a system of filters and analyzers. Sienna and her team moved with a rhythm born of desperation, every step balancing science and faith. James stood by the observation glass, pale from the repeated draws but unwavering. He watched as a final vial filled with a faint amber solution, his body distilled into hope. Sienna emerged, holding the vial like it was sacred. "This is it, a full serum. If it works, it could neutralize every trace of NBX42 in her system. If it doesn't..." "She dies," James finished. His voice was calm, but his hands tightened at his sides. "We don't wait. We try now." The room hushed as the serum was prepared. Nurses checked vitals, adjusted lines, and positioned the crash cart within arm's reach. James sat at Lila's bedside, brushing his thumb across her knuckles. "She called me Daddy," he whispered. His throat burned. I can't let that be her last word. Sienna's voice was steady, though her eyes betrayed her nerves. On my mark. 3, 2, 1. The syringe slid into the IV port. For a moment, nothing. Then Lila's body jerked, monitors spiking wildly. Her back arched, eyes fluttering open but unseeing. James held her hand tight. Fight, sweetheart, he begged. Fight with me. The storm raged inside her, each spasm a cruel reminder of how fragile life could be. Then, as suddenly as it began, her body slackened. The monitors steadied. Sienna's breath caught. It's holding. James closed his eyes, relief flooding through him. He bowed his head to her hand. You're safe now. But then, beep. A new alarm. Her blood pressure plummeted. No, James whispered. Sienna leaned over the monitor. It's the parasite's death throes. It's releasing toxins as it dies. Her system's overwhelmed. James's voice broke. Do something! Sienna grabbed another vial, flushed it through. Nurses scrambled. James bent close, his voice fierce. Stay! Stay with me. I'll give everything I have. Just don't leave. The line on the monitor flickered, low but steady. Color returned to her cheeks, faint but real. Sienna exhaled. She's through the worst of it. The serum worked. James, you saved her. James sank into the chair, every muscle trembling. He pressed his lips to Lila's forehead. She stirred faintly, whispering through cracked lips. Daddy. Tears blurred his vision. I'm here. For the first time, he believed it. Hours passed. Lila slept peacefully, her small chest rising with steady breaths. James remained beside her, unwilling to let go. Sienna entered quietly, carrying a folder. There's something you need to see. She laid out a series of lab reports, scans of Lila's blood. The parasite isn't just gone. It's destroyed. The antibodies from your serum annihilated it completely. That means two things. 1, Lila is safe. 2, she looked at him intently. Your blood could save every child Knox has touched. James's breath stilled. The weight of her words crashed over him. This wasn't just about Lila anymore. It was about countless children whose whispers had never been heard. Sienna's voice hardened. We'll need evidence, records, samples. Knox won't stop. If we want to end this, we need to bring it into the light. James thought of the anonymous email, the faceless threats. He thought of Isabel, still unconscious 2 floors below, and Lila, trusting him with her fragile heart. He looked up, his voice cold steel. Then we burn his empire to the ground. That night, as the hospital quieted, James sat by Lila's bed. He unfolded the crayon drawing she had made. The yellow house, the glowing windows, the 3 figures hand in hand. For the first time, he saw not just a child's wish, but a blueprint. A vision of what could be. He whispered, You gave me a family before I even realized I needed one. Lila stirred in her sleep, her lips forming the word again. Daddy. James leaned back, his exhaustion finally catching him. But as sleep pulled at him, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. His blood now carried more than antibodies. It carried purpose. And purpose was something Gregory Knox had no weapon against. Denver's night skyline flickered through the hospital window, neon signs pulsing like restless ghosts. James Whitaker stood with his back to it, his hand resting on the edge of Lila's bed. The steady rhythm of her breathing was the only thing keeping his thoughts from unraveling. She had survived. For now. But survival wasn't enough. If what Sienna had said was true, that his blood carried the antidote, then hiding was no longer an option. This wasn't just about Lila and Isabel anymore. It was about every child whose name had been erased by Gregory Knox's experiments. The door creaked open. Dr. Sienna Lee entered with a folder tucked under her arm. She looked worn but determined. "I've been cross-referencing the files you pulled from the motel with old FDA archives," she said. "NBX-42 didn't just disappear when it was banned, it went underground. What you found is the tip of something massive." James gestured to the chair. "Show me." She laid out documents across the table, falsified clinic reports, Shell Corporation ledgers, and lists of participants identified only by numbers. James felt his stomach turn. Children reduced to codes, their identities stripped away like disposable parts. "Where did this come from?" he asked. "Anonymous leaks," Sienna replied. "Activists have been trying to expose a network they call the Ghost Trials. For years it was whispers. Now, with Isabel's records and the compound in Lila's blood, we can prove it's real." James studied the data, his jaw tightening. "And Knox?" Sienna's eyes darkened. "He's at the center. He's been moving between Denver and Wyoming, running hidden labs through shell fronts. Every child he touches either disappears or comes out broken." A silence hung heavy. James looked over at Lila, asleep, her tiny hand clutching her bunny. The weight of responsibility pressed on him like iron. "I'm not a prosecutor," he said finally. "But I know how to fight monsters who hide behind money." He picked up his phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in years. "Ross Delaney," he said when the line clicked. "It's Whitaker. I need to see you tonight." 2 hours later, James sat in a small cafe near Union Station. The hum of late-night travelers covered their voices. Across from him sat Ross Delaney, a federal investigator whose career had been built, and nearly broken, on chasing pharmaceutical corruption. "You look like hell," Ross said bluntly, sipping black coffee. "I feel worse," James replied. "But I didn't drag you out here for pleasantries." He slid the folder across the table. "NBX-42, Ghost Trials, Children. My blood may hold the key to stopping it, but I need someone who can bring Knox down legally." Ross flipped through the pages, his expression shifting from skepticism to horror. "Jesus Christ, this isn't just malpractice. This is genocide in miniature." James's voice dropped. "And it's still happening. Isabel Monroe and her daughter are living proof." Ross tapped the papers. "If this is real, I'll need sworn testimony, secure labs, protective custody. Knox has deep pockets. He'll come after anyone who threatens his operation." "He already has," James said grimly. "He sent me a warning. Threatened to take Lila." Ross leaned back, exhaling. "Then you're in it whether you want to be or not." James met his eyes. "I want to be." For a moment, the old fire flickered in Ross's gaze. "Then we burn him to the ground." Back at the hospital, James filed for emergency guardianship of Lila with Ross's help. The legal documents were thick, the signatures endless. Yet with Isabel still unconscious, the court approved James as temporary guardian. When he showed the papers to Lila, she stared at them wide-eyed. "What does it mean?" she asked. James crouched beside her bed. "It means no one can take you away. Not Knox, not anyone. You're safe with me." She blinked, then crawled into his arms without a word. Her small frame fit perfectly against his chest, and James held her, as if anchoring her to the world. Later that night, Ross returned with grim news. "We raided a storage unit on the edge of Denver. Found hard drives, medical samples. It's worse than we thought. Knox has been running this across state lines, Wyoming included. Dozens of kids. James's jaw tightened. Then, we take him down. Ross nodded. We will. But James, this is going to get ugly. Trials, hearings, media storms. Knox will try to bury you, discredit you. You ready for that? James glanced at Lila, curled under blankets, her bunny tucked beneath her chin. For the first time, he didn't hesitate. Yes, he said, because she's worth it. Ross extended a hand. James clasped it firmly. Then let's finish this. The following morning, sunlight spilled into Isabel's room. James sat by her bedside, exhausted but resolute. For the first time in days, her eyes fluttered open. Where am I? She whispered. In a hospital, James said gently. You've been very sick. But you're safe now. Her gaze drifted, hazy, before focusing on him. Recognition flickered faintly. Lila? She's here. She's safe. She wants you to get better. Tears welled in Isabel's eyes. I tried to protect her, but he... Her voice broke. James leaned forward, his tone fierce. You don't have to fight alone anymore. I'll protect her now. Both of you. For the first time, Isabel's shoulders sagged with relief. She closed her eyes, whispering, Thank you. James sat back, his chest tight. The words felt less like gratitude and more like a passing of the torch. He glanced toward the doorway where Ross waited, folder in hand. This was no longer just a battle for one child. It was a war against an empire of shadows. And James Whitaker was ready to step into the light. The winter storms of Denver gave way to salt air and rolling surf. Days after Knox's network began to crumble under federal raids, James Whitaker made a choice. He flew Isabel and Lila far from Colorado's frozen nights to a quiet stretch of Santa Rosa Beach, Florida. The rented house sat on white sand, the kind that glowed under the morning sun like powdered glass. It was nothing like the steel and glass towers James had ruled for decades. It was simple. Wooden shutters, a porch swing that creaked in the breeze. For the first time in years, he felt like he had stepped into a place meant for healing, not hiding. Lila ran barefoot across the sand, her laughter rising above the surf. She chased gulls, leaving uneven footprints in the tide's edge, her stuffed bunny tucked under one arm. Every so often she turned back to wave at James, who stood on the porch steps, sleeves rolled up, watching her with something close to awe. Beside him, Isabel leaned on the railing. She was frail still, skin pale from the weeks of trauma, but her eyes were clearer than they had been in months. The ocean breeze tangled her hair, and she breathed deeply, as if it might carry away the residue of all that had been done to her. You didn't have to bring us here, she said softly. James kept his eyes on Lila. Yes, I did. She needed to know what the world feels like when it's safe. And you needed to see her run without fear. Isabel studied him for a moment. And you? James hesitated. I needed to remember there's a life outside of war, even if it's temporary. That evening they sat at a weathered picnic table near the dunes. Lila had insisted on drawing in the sand with a stick, etching clumsy shapes that stretched under the fading light. Look! She cried, pointing to the large heart she had drawn. Inside, she wrote carefully, Mom, me, Dad. Isabel's breath caught. She turned to James. She's already chosen you. James swallowed hard. She deserves more than a man who spent his life behind glass towers. Isabel shook her head. She deserves someone who stayed. And you did. Their conversation was cut short by the vibration of James's phone. He glanced at the screen. A secure message from Ross Delaney. Knox arrested. Attempted to flee across Canadian border. Evidence solid. Ghost trials finished. James exhaled, a weight lifting from his chest. It wasn't over. Trials, hearings, and public reckoning would follow, but the head of the serpent had been caught. He looked at Isabel, who read the truth in his expression. Relief washed across her face, followed by something more fragile. Hope. Then it's really done, she whispered. For Lila, James said. For all of them. That night, the beach house grew quiet. The rhythmic crash of waves filled the silence as James stood by the window, watching the moonlight silver the horizon. Isabel entered softly, her footsteps light. She's asleep, she said. She wanted you to tuck her in, but she couldn't keep her eyes open long enough. James smiled faintly. I'll check on her. But Isabel lingered. Her hands clasped together, nervous. She asked me something before she fell asleep. James turned. What was it? She asked if you'd still be her dad when the bad men were gone. Isabel's voice trembled. I didn't know what to say. Because I realized it's not really my decision anymore. It's yours. James felt his throat tighten. He crossed to the small kitchen table, pulled out a chair, and sat heavily. When I found her in that garage, I didn't know why I stopped. I thought I was just helping a lost child. But she gave me something I didn't know I needed. She called me Daddy before I ever earned it. Isabel's eyes softened. Then maybe the question isn't whether you choose her. Maybe it's whether you choose us. James looked at her, at the quiet strength in her fragile body, at the fire in her eyes that not even Knox had extinguished. He realized that in saving them, he had been saved too. The next morning, dawn painted the sky in shades of rose and gold. Lila ran to the shoreline, squealing as the waves chased her toes. James followed, slower, watching her etch another heart in the sand with her stick. This time she drew two hearts, one inside the other. See, she said, beaming up at him. One is for me and Mommy, the other's for our family. James knelt, his knees sinking into the cool sand. And who's in our family, Lila? She grinned. You, Mommy, me, Bunny. He laughed, the sound rusty but genuine. Bunny too, huh? Of course, she said solemnly, as if it were law. From the porch, Isabel watched them, her hand pressed to her lips. For a fleeting moment, she saw not a CEO, not a broken woman, but a man and a child carving new life into the sand. She called out, her voice steady despite the wind. James, she's already given you her heart. Now it's your turn. James turned toward her. Lila tugged at his hand. Say yes, Daddy. He looked at them both, the girl who had whispered in a garage for safety, the mother who had endured unthinkable torment, and felt something break open inside him. He nodded slowly, voice thick. Yes, I choose you. Both of you. Lila squealed, throwing her arms around his neck. Isabel's eyes filled with tears, and for the first time in years, she let herself believe in tomorrow. The waves surged, erasing the old footprints, but the hearts in the sand remained, stubborn against the tide. The conference hall in downtown Denver was filled to capacity, its glass walls reflecting the snow-dusted skyline outside. Cameras lined the aisles, reporters murmured, and physicians in white coats whispered in tense clusters. Everyone had come for the same reason, the unveiling of the Lila Foundation. At the center of the stage stood James Whittaker, not as the CEO who had once been feared in boardrooms, but as a man who had nearly lost everything and discovered what truly mattered. His suit was plain, his tie a soft blue that Lila had chosen because it looked happy. He cleared his throat, eyes sweeping across the crowd, then resting briefly on the front row. Isabel sat there, still fragile but stronger each day, her hand clasping Lila's. The little girl swung her legs, clutching Bunny in her lap, her face glowing with pride. James adjusted the microphone. For decades, I believed progress meant profit, that the future belonged to those who could outbuild, outspend, and outlast everyone else. But I was wrong. The room hushed. Cameras clicked softly. Progress, he continued, is not measured in skyscrapers or market shares. It is measured in lives protected, in voices heard, and in the courage to say, not one more child will be sacrificed for ambition. He lifted a folder from the podium. These are the records of the ghost trials, illegal experiments carried out on the most vulnerable among us. Children, stripped of identity and dignity, treated as disposable. Today, those records are in the hands of federal investigators. And tomorrow, they will be in the hands of the world. A ripple of gasps swept the audience. James's voice strengthened. I stand here not just as James Whittaker, but as the guardian of one of those children. A little girl who taught me that family is not defined by blood, but by love and the willingness to stay. This foundation bears her name, not mine. The Lila Foundation will fight to ensure that no child, anywhere, will ever again be used as an experiment. Applause erupted. Not polite applause, but raw, sustained clapping that shook the hall. Doctors stood, reporters lowered their pens, and for a moment, even the skeptics seemed moved. James stepped back, his chest tight, his eyes glistening. On the front row, Lila grinned wide and whispered loudly enough for the cameras to catch, "That's my daddy!" The room softened with laughter and a collective sigh. Later that afternoon, the family returned to the beach house in Florida. The press, the storm of questions, the weight of responsibility, it all melted into the simple rhythm of the waves. Lila sat in the sand, her stick tracing two large hearts. She pressed seashells into the outline, decorating them with the seriousness of an artist. "This one's for me and Mommy," she explained. "And this one's for our family. Forever." James knelt beside her, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. "Forever," he echoed. Isabel joined them, lowering herself carefully onto the sand. She looked healthier now, color returning to her cheeks. Watching Lila, her voice caught. "She never stopped believing we'd find safety. And she was right. Because of you." James shook his head. "Because of us. I couldn't have done this alone." A long silence fell, broken only by the surf. Then Isabel whispered, "She has a father now, and I have peace for the first time in years." James turned to her. In her eyes he saw gratitude, but also something more tender, something fragile and waiting. He reached for her hand. She didn't pull away. Together they sat with Lila as the tide rolled in, washing gently at the edges of the hearts in the sand, but never erasing them completely. That evening, after dinner, Lila insisted on a bedtime story. But instead of pulling a book from the shelf, she climbed onto James's lap and said, "Tell me the story of us." James blinked. "The story of us?" She nodded seriously. "When you found me in the garage." His throat tightened. He looked at Isabel, who nodded encouragingly. Then he began, his voice low and warm. "Once, There was a man who thought he was alone in the world. He built towers so high he couldn't hear his own heart anymore. But one night in a quiet garage, he heard a whisper. A little girl who needed someone to stay. Lila's eyes shone. And did he stay? James hugged her close. Forever. She smiled sleepily, resting her head against his chest. That's my favorite story. Moments later, she was asleep, her small breaths steady. James carried her to bed, tucked Bunny beside her, and stood for a long while, watching the gentle rise and fall of her chest. When he returned to the porch, Isabel was waiting. The night air smelled of salt and jasmine. They sat side by side in silence, the stars stretching endlessly above. Finally, James whispered, "She gave me back my life." Isabel turned, her hand finding his. "And you gave her back hers." Their fingers intertwined, not with urgency, but with the quiet certainty of people who had walked through fire and found each other on the other side. The next morning, the sun rose over the gulf, casting the beach in gold. Lila bounded out the door, dragging James and Isabel with her. She etched another heart into the sand, larger this time, and inside it she wrote in clumsy letters, "Family." James bent down, his arm around both of them. The sea breeze tugged at his shirt, the waves lapped at their feet, and for the first time in decades, he felt whole. He realized then that he hadn't just saved a child. He had saved himself. And as the tide carried their laughter out to sea, James Whittaker knew this was the legacy worth leaving. Not wealth, not towers of glass, but love strong enough to outlast even the darkest storm. Thank you for staying with us until the very end of James, Isabel, and little Lila's journey. This was not just a story about a millionaire CEO. It was about the healing power of love, the courage to protect the innocent, and the gift of finding family where we least expect it. If this story touched your heart, we'd love for you to subscribe so you never miss the next journey of hope, redemption, and second chances. Because sometimes, the greatest wealth we can share is simply love.